The morning that Alvin Courthouse walked into the John Deere dealership in Wapakoneta, Ohio, and said he wanted to discuss purchasing 12 tractors was a Tuesday in March of 1977, and the dealership's general manager, whose name was Fenwick, was in the back office reviewing the first quarter's sales projections when his parts manager knocked and said there was a customer at the desk who wanted to talk about a multiple tractor purchase, and that the customer was Alvin Courthouse from the Auglaize, County Bottomland. Fenwick had known the name Courthouse from the dealership's customer records, in the same way that agricultural equipment dealers knew the names of the farms within their county's service radius. As a low-frequency customer whose transaction history showed a single used equipment purchase in 1969, a parts account that was active but not high volume, and an operation that the dealership's general assessment characterized as a modest family farm in the Blanchard River drainage in the southern part of the county. The assessment was not detailed and was not recent. It was the surface assessment of an institution that tracked customers by their transactions rather than by their financial positions. Fenwick had come to the sales floor to handle the conversation himself, which was the appropriate response to a customer who had expressed an interest in a multiple unit purchase, and which was also the response of a man who had 20 years of agricultural equipment sales experience and who could assess within 3 minutes of a conversation whether a customer's expressed interest in a large purchase was real or aspirational. He had assessed Alvin Courthouse in the first 3 minutes and had arrived at the conclusion that the assessment of the aspiring purchaser warranted. The man in front of him was in his mid-50s, wearing the work clothes of an active farm operator, speaking with the matter-of-fact delivery of someone who had prepared for the conversation, but operating from an account base and a land holding that the dealership's general knowledge of the county's farm size distribution suggested was insufficient for a 12-tractor purchase to be anything other than an opening negotiating position, or a misunderstanding about what 12 tractors would cost. He had said, with the professional warmth that 20 years of agricultural equipment sales had refined into a specific tone of gentle reality setting, "Mr. Courthouse, 12 tractors is a significant investment. Can you help me understand the scale of the operation you're working with? We want to make sure we're pointing you toward the right equipment for what you need." Alvin had said, "I'm aware of what 12 tractors cost. I've been watching your lot inventory since October. I know what's on the lot and what the list prices are. I want to discuss what a cash purchase of 12 units would look like in terms of pricing." The word cash had entered the conversation. Fenwick had received it with the practiced assessment of a man who had heard the word cash used in multiple contexts and who understood that the word's relevance depended entirely on whether the speaker's financial position supported what the word implied. The surface assessment of Alvin Courthouse's operation had not suggested a financial position that supported a 12-tractor cash purchase. He had said, "Let me get some coffee, and we can sit down and talk through this more completely." The conversation in the back office had been the kind of conversation that became a story in the Wapakoneta agricultural equipment community. Because of what it required the dealership to discover about a customer it had been providing service to for 8 years without understanding what the service was serving. Fenwick had asked, as he always asked in preliminary discussions about significant purchases, about the operation's scale, acreage, crops, current equipment fleet. Alvin had answered directly, 620 acres of Auglaize and Hardin County bottomland, all in the family's ownership, corn and soybean rotation, current fleet of 6 tractors ranging in age from 1963 to 1974, all maintained to working condition, no institutional debt against any acre or any machine. The no institutional debt statement had been the specific element that had changed the conversation's character. Fenwick had asked, in the specific way that sales professionals ask clarifying questions about statements that challenged their prior assessments, When you say no institutional debt, can you describe what you mean? Alvin had said, "The farm carries no notes. The land is in the family's ownership, free and clear. The equipment has been purchased from the equipment fund without financing since my father started the fund in 1951. The fund's current balance is sufficient for the purchase I want to discuss, and I have brought documentation from the Wapakoneta National Bank that confirms the liquid asset position if you need it." He had placed the bank letter on Fenwick's desk. Fenwick had read it. He had said nothing for a moment. He had said 620 acres, no debt, and liquid assets sufficient for this transaction. Alvin had said, "Correct." Fenwick had said, "I owe you an apology for the way I opened this conversation." Alvin had said, "You were working from the information you had. The information was incomplete." Fenwick had said, "How did we not know this about your operation?" Alvin had said, "You know our parts account and our transaction history. You don't know our farm account. I don't share the farm account with the dealer. I share it with the bank when the bank is relevant and with no one else." The bank has been relevant twice. Once in 1951, when my father took a short note for the drainage tile installation, and once this morning when I asked them to document the fund balance for this conversation. Fenwick had said, "Your father took one note in his farming career," Alvin had said, "and paid it in 18 months. The tile has been draining the south quarter correctly since 1952. The transaction had taken the full day and extended into the following morning before the terms were confirmed. 12 tractors from the Wapakoneta JD lot inventory, ranging from the small utility units to 3 of the mid-range row crop machines that the courthouse operation's 620-acre scale required, negotiated at a package discount that the dealership's ownership had approved specifically for the first all-cash 12-tractor purchase in the dealership's 19-year history. The package discount had been 24% below the aggregate list price, the largest percentage discount the dealership had extended on any single transaction, authorized by the ownership after Fenwick had called the ownership's principal in the late afternoon of Tuesday and had described the situation. The ownership's principal had said, "Is the bank letter verified?" Fenwick had said he had called the Wapakoneta National Bank directly and confirmed the letter's authenticity and the fund balance it described. The ownership's principal had authorized the package discount and had said, "I have been selling John Deere equipment in this county since 1958, and this is the first time a customer has walked in with a bank letter for a 12-tractor cash purchase. Make sure we do right by him." Fenwick had made sure. The transaction had been completed on Wednesday morning. The check had cleared by noon. The 12 tractors had been delivered to the courthouse farm in the Auglaize County bottomland across the following week. The Wapakoneta agricultural equipment community had heard about the transaction in the way that significant agricultural transactions traveled through the community, through the dealership staff, through the bank, through the network of farmers and suppliers and equipment operators who constituted the county's informal information system. The specific elements that had made the transaction memorable to the community were the scale, 12 tractors, and the method, cash from a fund that had been building since 1951, and the opening exchange which had reached the community in a compressed form that preserved its essential content. The dealer had assumed the man couldn't afford 12 tractors, and the man had placed a bank letter on the desk that had changed the conversation's character completely. The compressed form had contained the detail about Fenwick's opening comment, the professional warmth and the reality-setting tone that had preceded the bank letter. And this detail had entered the community's account of the transaction as the specific moment that the story turned on. The dealer had made the opening assessment of a customer who appeared to be a modest family farm operator, with aspirational ideas about a large equipment purchase. And the bank letter had been the correction of that assessment and the simultaneous demonstration of why the assessment had been incorrect. Fenwick's response to the correction, "I owe you an apology for the way I opened this conversation, had also entered the community's account, carried by a member of the dealership staff who had been in the back office for part of the conversation and who had considered the exchange worth repeating accurately. The apology had communicated something about Fenwick's character that the community had received with the specific appreciation of people who valued honest acknowledgement of wrong assessment over defensive maintenance of an incorrect position. Alvin had said in the Auglaize County Farm Bureau meeting that spring, when the transaction had been the subject of the community's ongoing conversation, "I was not offended by how the dealer opened the conversation. He was working from the information he had. The information was incomplete because the farm account is private. The relevant information was the bank letter, and I brought the bank letter because I knew the visible information would not support the conclusion I wanted the conversation to reach." This formulation, "I knew the visible information would not support the conclusion I wanted the conversation to reach," had been the community's most memorable extract from the Farm Bureau meeting's account of the transaction. It had captured, in the specific language of agricultural community analysis, the thing that the transaction had illustrated about the relationship between visible evidence and actual financial position. That the visible evidence of a farming operation's character and the actual financial position of that operation were not the same information, and that the gap between them was often wider than the visible evidence suggested. The gap in Alvin Courthouse's case had been the specific gap that an equipment fund discipline applied consistently for 26 years could produce. The difference between a farm that looked like a modest 600-acre bottomland operation in Auglaize County and a farm account that showed 620 unencumbered acres, no institutional debt since the 1952 tile notes payoff, and a fund balance that had been building at the family's specified rate through the commodity price cycles and the farm crisis years and the mid-1970s expansion and the general turbulence of 2 decades of American agricultural economics. The commodity boom years of the mid-1970s had been the years immediately preceding the March 1977 transaction, and the community that had watched the courthouse operation across those years had observed it through the specific lens of the boom's general context. The operations that were expanding their land base on the favorable lending terms, the operations that were replacing their equipment on the favorable equipment credit terms, the general atmosphere of expansion that the commodity prices and the institutional lending environment had created. The courthouse operation had not participated in the expansion in the way that many county operations had. It had not acquired additional land through institutional financing during the boom years. It had continued the equipment replacement sequence from the fund at the fund's specified rate, acquiring used equipment from dispersals at the cash prices that the fund's balance supported. The community had noted the courthouse operation's non-participation in the boom expansion as a data point consistent with the modest family farm assessment that the visible evidence supported. The non-participation had looked from the outside like a farm that was either unwilling or unable to capitalize on the favorable conditions that the boom years were providing. It had not looked like a farm that was building toward a 12-tractor cash purchase in March of 1977 from a fund that had been accumulating since 1951. The fund's accumulation had been what made the March 1977 transaction possible, and the March 1977 transaction had been possible in March of 1977 specifically because the commodity boom years had provided favorable operating income that had accelerated the fund's accumulation rate beyond the base rate that the 26-year accumulation average had produced. The boom years had not been the opportunity to expand on credit. They had been the opportunity to accelerate the fund's accumulation toward the transaction that the fund's reaching its target balance would make possible. The target balance had been the 12-tractor transaction's estimated cost at the package discount that Alvin had been calculating since October of 1976, when he had begun the serious assessment of the lot inventory and the package pricing that a cash transaction would support. He had arrived at the March meeting with the target balance confirmed and the package discount range estimated and the bank letter documenting the position that the confirmation required. The transaction had been executed as planned. Fenwick had understood, after the Wednesday morning completion and the week of delivery, and the subsequent days of processing what had happened, that the March 1977 transaction had revealed a specific limitation in the dealership's customer assessment methodology. The limitation that Alvin had described precisely when he had said, "You know our parts account and our transaction history. You don't know our farm account." The farm account was the information that the dealership's customer assessment had not been designed to access, and the farm account was the information that the March 1977 transaction had been built on. He had said to his sales manager in April of 1977, a month after the transaction, "Every farmer in this county who has been a low-frequency customer at this dealership for the past 10 years deserves a fresh assessment. We know what they've bought from us. We don't know what they have. Those are different things, and we've been treating them as the same thing." The sales manager had said, "How do you propose to know what they have?" Fenwick had said, "I don't propose to know without asking. I propose to ask differently. When a customer comes in for a significant purchase conversation, I'm going to ask about the farm account position rather than making an assessment from the transaction history. The transaction history tells me what they've done with us. The farm account tells me what they're working with. The courthouse transaction would have opened differently if I'd asked about the farm account from the beginning." The sales manager had said, "Most farmers won't share the farm account." Fenwick had said, "Most farmers don't need to share the farm account if the conversation's opening assumption is that the operation might have any financial position rather than the position the visible evidence suggests. The opening assumption should be neutral, not accessorial. Courthouse placed the bank letter on the desk because he anticipated my accessorial opening. If the opening had been neutral, tell me about your operation. He might not have needed the bank letter at all. This analysis of the conversation's opening had been the specific professional learning that the March 1977 transaction had produced for Fenwick, and it had changed the way he opened subsequent conversations with customers who expressed interest in significant purchases. The change had been specific, the replacement of the reality-setting warmth that had characterized his opening to Alvin Courthouse with a genuinely neutral inquiry that did not embed an assessment in its framing. The change had been noticed by the dealership's sales staff across the following months and had been explicitly discussed at the quarterly staff meeting in June of 1977, where Fenwick had described the March transaction and its professional implications directly, rather than allowing the lesson to remain implicit in the changed behavior. He had said at the June meeting, "The courthouse transaction taught me that I had been opening large purchase conversations with an assessment already formed. The assessment was based on transaction history and visible operation characteristics. The assessment was sometimes wrong in the direction of underestimating the customer's position. We lost nothing in the courthouse transaction because the customer was patient enough to produce the bank letter. In a different customer with less patience, the accessorial opening might have ended the conversation before the bank letter was produced. We cannot afford to end conversations we should not be ending." The staff had received this analysis with the attention that a sales team gave to a principal who was being direct about his own professional error. The attention had been genuine because the error had been genuine and the acknowledgement had been genuine, and the professional lesson had been specific and actionable. Alvin had not been present at the June staff meeting. He had been at the Courthouse Farm in the Auglaize County bottomland, beginning the first season with the 12 new tractors, deploying them in the specific sequence that the farm's 620-acre rotation required, and that the equipment fund's planned purchase had been built around. The deployment had been planned in the same detail that the purchase had been planned. The specific assignment of each unit to the specific operations and positions within the fleet hierarchy that the operations scale and crop requirements determined. His son David had been working the farm since 1972 and had been present for the transaction planning from the October 1976 assessment of the lot inventory through the March 1977 conversation at the dealership and the Wednesday completion and the week of deliveries. He had been 28 years old and had been absorbing the farm accounts management methodology since the late 1960s, when his father had begun including him in the November reviews and the equipment fund discussions that the reviews generated. David had driven the first delivered tractor from the dealer transport to its assigned equipment yard position and had stood in the yard looking at the 12 machines in the morning light of the delivery week. He had said to his father, when Alvin had walked over to the yard, "The dealer thought you were dreaming." Alvin had said the dealer was working from what he could see. He couldn't see the fund. The fund was the dream that had been working since 1951. David had said 26 years. Alvin had said 26 years of the fund at the specified rate, plus the 5 years the boom gave us above the base rate. 31 years if you count the boom contribution at the base rate equivalent. The fund takes time. The transaction is what the time produced. David had said, "What does the farm account show now?" Alvin had said, "The fund is at 0. The rebuild begins this November at the established rate. The next transaction will be when the next fund reaches the threshold for the next right opportunity." David had written this in the farm accounts margin at the November 1977 review. Fund at 0 after March transaction. Rebuild begins established rate. The next transaction is when the fund reaches the threshold for the next right opportunity. The time between 0 and the threshold is the fund doing its work. The margin note had been in the account since November 1977. The fund had been rebuilding from 0 since that November at the established rate. The percentage of operating surplus that the Courthouse Farm account had been directing to the equipment fund column since Alvin's father had established it in 1951, and that Alvin had maintained, and that David had continued after taking over primary management in the mid-1980s, when Alvin's health had made the transition both practical and planned. Fenwick had continued managing the Wapakoneta JD dealership through the farm crisis years of the early 1980s, and the farm crisis had been the specific period when the professional lesson of the March 1977 courthouse transaction had been most visibly vindicated. The farm crisis had exposed the gap between visible operation characteristics and actual financial positions across the county in the specific direction that the courthouse transaction had illustrated, but in the opposite direction. Where the courthouse gap had been between a modest-appearing operation and a strong financial position, the farm crisis gaps had been between ambitious-appearing operations and financial positions that the crisis had revealed as structurally vulnerable. The county operations that had appeared most prosperous in 1978 and 1979, the ones with the largest new equipment investments and the most visible expansion, had been the operations that the farm crisis had put in the most difficult conversations with their lenders in 1982 and 1983. The operations that had appeared most modest, the ones whose equipment investment levels had communicated the limiting or conservative assessment that the community had applied to the visible evidence, had been the ones that were still operating in 1983 without restructuring conversations. The courthouse farm had been in the second category. The fund had continued to rebuild from the March 1977 0 through the farm crisis years without interruption, at the percentage of operating surplus that the established rate specified. The operating surplus had been smaller in the crisis years than in the mid-1970s boom years, but it had remained positive. The farm's debt-free position meant that the no-note tradition's primary benefit, the absence of note service consuming the operating surplus, had been most visible precisely in the years when the note service on other operations, equipment and land financing was consuming whatever surplus the declining commodity prices had left available. Fenwick had mentioned the courthouse farm to a colleague in the spring of 1983 at a dealer association meeting in Columbus, where the farm crisis was the primary subject of the industry's conversation. He had said, "I have a customer in Auglaize County who bought 12 tractors for cash in March of '77. I made an accessorial opening in that conversation that I've regretted ever since, not because I offended him, he was gracious about it, but because the opening revealed a professional assumption about that customer's financial position that was completely wrong. I've been trying to correct that assumption in how I open conversations ever since." His colleague had asked, what was wrong about the assumption? Fenwick had said, "I assumed that a low transaction history customer from a county farm that looked modest was not in a position for a 12-tractor purchase." The assumption was wrong because the customer's farm account showed 26 years of equipment fund accumulation that the transaction history couldn't show. I was reading the transaction history as a proxy for the financial position. The transaction history was a proxy for the transaction history, not for the financial position. Those are different things. The colleague had said, "How do you correct for that?" Fenwick had said, "I ask about the farm account instead of assuming from the transaction history. Most customers don't have a courthouse situation, a 26-year fund at the threshold for a 12-tractor purchase, but some do. And the one that does, in the conversation where I make the accessorial opening, is the one I've set on the wrong tone for the most important transaction of my dealership career." He had paused and had said, "I've never made that opening again." Every significant purchase conversation since March of '77 has started with a genuinely open question about the operation. The courthouse transaction taught me that I was closing conversations I should have been opening. This account of the professional learning had entered the dealer association meeting's conversation as the specific anecdote that illustrated the broader question the crisis year was making visible. The gap between how agricultural operations appeared and how they were actually positioned financially. The farm crisis had been exposing that gap across the Midwest in the direction of worse than appearance, the prosperous-looking farm that was in restructuring. The courthouse transaction had been the March 1977 version of the gap in the better-than-appearance direction. The modest-looking farm that was in the position to buy 12 tractors for cash. The same gap, pointing in opposite directions, illustrated by the same limitation. The institutional assessment's inability to distinguish between what a farming operation looked like and what it actually was. Alvin Courthouse had placed a bank letter on Fenwick's desk in March of 1977. The bank letter had been the moment the gap had closed. The gap had been 26 years of the fund doing its work in a farm account that Fenwick had never seen. The farm account had been in the courthouse farmhouse in the Auglaize County bottomland. The farmhouse had been there since Alvin's father had built it in the 1930s. The farm account had been in the same format since Alvin's father had started it in the same decade. The fund column had been added in 1951. The fund had been building since 1951. The transaction had been in March of 1977. 26 years. That was the gap. That was what Fenwick had regretted. Not the courtesy or the graciousness of the conversation. Alvin had received both and had been genuinely ungrudging about the accessorial opening. What Fenwick had regretted was the professional assumption that a farm operation's visible characteristics and its financial position were the same information. They were not the same information. The courthouse transaction had confirmed this in March of 1977 with a bank letter placed on a desk. The farm crisis had confirmed it in 1982 and 1983 in the opposite direction. Both confirmations had come from the same gap, the gap between the visible and the actual. The farm account was the actual. The farm account was always the actual. That was the whole account. That was everything. The fund rebuilt from zero in November 1977 at the established rate, as it had done since 1951. After every transaction, that was sufficient. That was the whole of it. The farm account that Alvin's father had started in the 1930s, and that Alvin had continued and that David was maintaining into the 1990s, was a document whose specific column structure had produced, across 50 years of consistent application, the kind of legibility that only long-duration discipline applied to a consistent format could produce. The ability to read the account's history and understand not just what had happened, but why each decision had been made and what the decision had been, building toward. The equipment fund column was the account's most distinctive feature relative to the standard farm account format that Auglaize County farming operations maintained. Most farm accounts of the era tracked the standard operating categories: crop income, operating expense, equipment maintenance, land tax, and the running balance. The courthouse account had these columns and had added, in 1951, the specific column that tracked the accumulation toward the equipment replacement that the no-debt tradition made possible only if the accumulation was systematic rather than opportunistic. The no-debt tradition itself had been older than the fund column. It had been the founding principle of the farm accounts management since Alvin's father had established the account in the 1930s on the specific lesson of the Depression years, which had taught the Auglaize County farming community in general and the courthouse family in particular that the farming operations that survived the Depression with their land intact were the operations that had not leveraged the land against debt, obligations that the Depression's income environment could not service. The courthouse family had entered the Depression without debt and had survived the Depression without debt because the no-debt principle had been the family's operating framework since before the Depression had created the conditions that validated it. Alvin had been born in 1922 and had grown up watching the Depression's effects on the Auglaize County farming community from the specific vantage point of a family that was not experiencing those effects in the way that the leveraged operations were. He had understood from his father's kitchen table conversations in the 1930s that the farm's survival of the Depression was not luck. It was the direct result of a decision made before the Depression arrived to not leverage the farm against debt that the farming income would need to service. The decision had been made when the leveraging had seemed safe and the discipline had seemed unnecessary. The Depression had revealed the decision's wisdom in the specific way that adverse conditions always revealed prior decisions' wisdom, by showing what happened when the decision had not been made. His father had said to him in a conversation that Alvin had described to David and that David had written in the farm accounts margin in the late 1970s. The discipline is easy when the conditions are favorable and appears unnecessary when the conditions are favorable. The discipline is necessary when the conditions are unfavorable and appears wise only in retrospect when the unfavorable conditions have revealed what the discipline protected. The problem is that the retrospective wisdom arrives too late to apply to the decisions that the favorable conditions are producing. You have to apply the discipline before the unfavorable conditions arrive, when the discipline appears unnecessary, in order to have the protection when the unfavorable conditions reveal its value. David had written this in the farm accounts margin in 1978, during the commodity boom years when the Auglaize County farming community was in the middle of the expansion that the farm crisis would eventually unwind. He had been watching the expansion from the courthouse operation's specific vantage point, an operation that had just completed the 12-tractor cash purchase in March of 1977 and whose fund was rebuilding from zero at the established rate, while the adjacent operations were adding equipment on dealer financing and land on institutional notes at the pace that the boom years were supporting. The vantage point had been specific. He could see the expansion happening, understand its logic in the favorable conditions that prevailed, and watch his father's farm account rebuild its fund from zero at the established rate without participating in the expansion, because the fund's zero balance had been the result of the transaction that the fund's 26-year accumulation had produced, not the absence of expansion capital. The fund would rebuild, the expansion opportunities would pass. The next transaction would be when the fund reached the threshold for the next right opportunity. The expansion had passed. The farm crisis had unwound much of what the expansion had built in the operations that had leveraged the favorable conditions. The courthouse fund had rebuilt from zero to the level that the farm crisis years' reduced operating surplus had produced, smaller than it would have been if the boom years' surplus rates had continued, but positive and continuing and uninterrupted by the note service that would have consumed it if the no-debt tradition had been suspended for the expansion. David had taken over primary management in the mid-1980s, when Alvin's health had made the transition practical. The management transition had been accompanied by the kitchen table conversation that the courthouse family used for such transitions, the farm account open, the columns explained in the relationship terms that the account's format supported, the fund column's history from 1951 to the transition year visible in the accumulated entries. Alvin had said at the kitchen table in the fall of 1984, when the transition had been formalized, the fund and the no-debt principle are not separable. The fund is how you maintain the no-debt principle across the equipment replacement cycle. Without the fund, the no-debt principle would require either never replacing equipment or replacing it from the operating surplus in a way that depleted the operating reserve. The fund solves the replacement problem without financing by accumulating the replacement capital in advance of the replacement need. The advance accumulation requires patience. The patience requires the discipline. The discipline requires keeping the fund at the specified rate, regardless of what the operating surplus is doing in any given year. David had said, "The fund contribution at the specified rate in the bad years is the hardest part of the discipline." Alvin had said, "The fund contribution at the specified rate in the bad years is the most important part of the discipline. The contribution in the good years is easy, the surplus is adequate, and the percentage is painless. The contribution in the bad years is the test of whether the discipline is real or aspirational. If the contribution drops in the bad years, the fund's accumulation rate is not reliable and the timing of the next transaction becomes unpredictable. The transaction needs to happen when the fund is ready, not when the operating environment is favorable. If the fund's readiness depends on the operating environment being favorable, the fund is not doing the work the fund is designed to do." David had written this in the margin too. Contribution in bad years, no test of discipline. If contribution drops in bad years, fund's readiness depends on favorable conditions. Fund designed to be ready independent of conditions. Bad years are when discipline is real. The margin note had been beside the 1984 transition entry. It had been read at the November review every year since. The fund had been contributed to at the specified rate in every year. The good years of the late 1980s, the difficult years of the early 1990s, the favorable years of the mid to late 1990s, the mixed years of the early 2000s. The contribution had varied in absolute amount with the operating surplus's variation, because the contribution was a percentage of the surplus. But the percentage had not dropped. The Wapakoneta JD dealership had been sold in 1989 and had changed ownership twice since, but Fenwick had stayed through the first ownership change and had retired in 1991 after 33 years of agricultural equipment sales. His final transaction with the courthouse operation had been a routine parts purchase in the winter of 1990, and the transaction had been unremarkable in every respect except that it had been with a farm account that he had been thinking about since March of 1977. He had said to David at the parts counter in December of 1990, after the transaction was complete, "Your father and I had a conversation in March of 77 that I've thought about more than any other conversation in 33 years at this dealership." David had said the 12 tractor transaction. Fenwick had said the opening of the conversation, before the bank letter. David had said, "My father told me about it. He said you were gracious once the letter was on the desk." Fenwick had said, "I was gracious because he was right and I was wrong, and the letter made that clear. The regret was not about anything between me and your father. He was entirely generous about it. The regret was about what the opening had revealed about my professional assumptions. I'd been making the same accessorial opening with customers who expressed interest in large purchases for 15 years before that conversation. I stopped after it." David had said, "What did you do differently?" Fenwick had said, "I asked neutrally about the operation instead of assuming from the visible evidence. I treated the transaction history and the financial position as separate pieces of information instead of treating the transaction history as a proxy for the financial position." David had said, "That seems like a fundamental correction." Fenwick had said, "It is. It was a fundamental error. The error was professionally convenient. The assessment gave me a quick read on which customers warranted serious investment of my attention and which were aspirational. The error was that the quick read was wrong about your father's operation and probably wrong about other operations whose financial positions I never discovered because the accessorial opening made the conversation unproductive before the relevant information was on the table." He had paused and had said, 23 years, and I still regret the opening of that conversation. David had said, "My father didn't." Fenwick had said, "I know. That made the regret harder, not easier. He was more generous about my error than the error warranted. That generosity made it something I kept thinking about." David had driven back to the courthouse farm from the parts purchase and had told his father about the parking lot conversation with Fenwick. Alvin had been in his mid-60s by then, retired from field management but present in the kitchen table conversations that the farm accounts review required. He had listened to David's account of what Fenwick had said and had been quiet for a moment. He had said, "Fenwick is a good man who made an honest professional mistake and corrected it honestly. That is more than most." David had said, "He still regrets it after 23 years. Alvin had said, "He regrets the professional error, not the outcome. The outcome was fine. The transaction was completed on terms that were correct for both parties. The error was in the opening, the assumption that the visible information was sufficient for the assessment. The regret is appropriate. The assumption was not appropriate." He had said, "The assumption was not malicious. It was the standard professional shortcut of a man whose job requires him to assess dozens of customers and who uses transaction history as a proxy for financial position because financial position is private. The shortcut is reasonable when the population of customers is similar. The shortcut fails for the outlier. I was the outlier." David had said, "The outlier with a 26-year fund." Alvin had said, "The outlier whose grandfather started the no-debt framework in the 1930s and whose father added the fund column in 1951 and who had been contributing at the specified rate since 1951 through every operating condition without interruption. The 26 years was the fund doing the work the fund was designed to do." Fenwick saw the transaction history. He didn't see the work. David had said he regrets not seeing the work. Alvin had said what he regrets is the professional assumption that the transaction history showed the work. The transaction history showed what we bought from him. The work was in the farm account. The farm account was here. He had gestured toward the filing cabinet where the farm account was kept. The filing cabinet was in the courthouse farmhouse kitchen. The farm account was in the filing cabinet. The fund column was in the farm account. The fund column had been there since 1951. 33 years when the parking lot conversation happened. Fenwick had spent 33 years regretting a 3-minute accessorial opening. The regret was proportionate. The opening had been incorrect. The bank letter had been the correction. The farm account had been the foundation the bank letter described. That was the whole account. That was everything. 12 tractors, 26 years, a bank letter on a desk, and a dealer who spent the rest of his career asking differently because of it. That was sufficient. The specific texture of the courthouse farm account's November review process, the annual accounting that had been the discipline's primary enforcement mechanism since Alvin's father had established the format in the 1930s, deserved an accounting that the general description of the fund column and the percentage contribution could not fully provide, because the November review was not simply the recording of the year's financial results. It was the specific engagement with the fund's position and trajectory that made the discipline operational rather than aspirational. Alvin had explained the November review to David in the late 1960s, when David had been in his early 20s and was beginning to participate in the review as an observer and then as a contributor. He had said, "The November review is not the accounting of what happened this year. It is the accounting of where the farm is in its plan. The plan runs across multiple years. The November review is the annual reading of the plan's progress." David had asked, "What is the plan?" Alvin had said, "The plan is the farm account's fund column building from zero to the threshold of the next transaction, and then the transaction, and then the rebuild from zero to the threshold of the following transaction. The plan has no specified end date and no specified final transaction. It runs as long as the farm runs, which is the family's intention." David had said, "What is the threshold for the next transaction?" Alvin had said, "At the moment, the threshold is the 12-tractor purchase we have been planning since 1970. The threshold for that purchase is the fund balance that makes a cash transaction possible at the estimated lot discount that a cash purchase of that scale would support. I have been revising the threshold estimate since October of last year, based on the lot inventory and the price observations I make at the dealership and at the 2 other dealers in the county." David had said, "You've been planning this transaction since 1970. Alvin had said, "I started the planning when the fund balance crossed the level where a significant transaction was becoming a realistic near-term possibility. The fund had been building since 51. By 70, the balance had reached the range where a 12-tractor cash purchase was a question of the right conditions and the right lot inventory, rather than a question of whether the fund was sufficient in principle. The planning from 70 onward has been tracking the conditions and the inventory toward the specific transaction that the conditions and the inventory would eventually support." This account of the 7-year planning horizon between 1970 and the March 1977 transaction had been the information that the Auglaize County farming community had not possessed when it had been watching the courthouse operations' non-participation in the commodity boom expansion. The community had been watching a farm that was not expanding during the most favorable expansion conditions in a generation. The community had not known that the farm was planning a 12-tractor cash purchase that would occur in March of 1977 because the farm account's fund column was approaching the threshold that the planning had identified in 1970. The 7-year planning horizon was the specific element of the courthouse approach that distinguished it from opportunistic acquisition. The difference between buying when something becomes available and buying when the fund is at the threshold for the right transaction. The opportunistic approach required the transaction to present itself when the fund happened to be at a level that supported it. The planned approach required the fund to be at the threshold when the conditions that made the transaction favorable were in place. The March 1977 conditions, a lot inventory that matched the fleet replacement need, a commodity boom that had accelerated the fund's accumulation above its base rate, and a dealer environment in which the cash purchase of 12 units would support a package discount that made the transaction economically superior to any alternative timing, had been the specific combination that the 7-year planning horizon had been tracking toward. The conditions had converged in March of 1977, and the planning had recognized the convergence, and the transaction had been executed when the convergence was confirmed. The dealership had not known about the 7-year planning horizon. Fenwick had not known about it when he had made the assessorial opening, or when the bank letter had corrected his assessment, or when the transaction had been completed on Wednesday morning. He had learned about it later, through David's account of the planning timeline, when Fenwick had asked, in one of the subsequent year's interactions, how long the transaction had been in preparation. He had said, when David had told him 7 years, 7 years of planning, and I almost turned him around at the door with an assessorial question about whether he could afford what he was asking for. David had said, you would not have turned him around. He came prepared for the assessorial opening. The bank letter was prepared specifically because he anticipated it. Fenwick had said, the preparation for my error was part of the transaction's planning. David had said, the planning included knowing that the visible information would not support the conclusion the conversation needed to reach, and preparing the documentation that would bridge the gap between the visible information and the actual position. Fenwick had said, he planned for my mistake. David had said, he planned for the standard professional assumption that the transaction history was a proxy for the financial position. He didn't know you specifically. He knew the assumption was standard. This exchange had been the most precise account of the bank letter's role in the transaction planning that had entered the community's understanding. The specific information that the bank letter had been prepared as part of the transaction's planning, because the planning had anticipated the assessorial opening and had included the documentation that would correct it. The planning had included the correction for the institutional assumption. The institutional assumption had been standard. The correction had been the bank letter. The bank letter had been on the desk. The desk had been in the Wapakoneta JD dealership's back office. The back office had been where Fenwick had said, I owe you an apology for the way I opened this conversation. Alvin had said, you were working from the information you had. The information was incomplete. This exchange, I owe you an apology, you were working from the information you had been the community's other enduring extract from the March 1977 transaction, alongside the bank letter on the desk and the 12 tractors and the 26-year fund. It had communicated something about both parties that the community had received as specific to each. Fenwick's willingness to acknowledge the error directly without defensiveness, and Alvin's willingness to release the error without holding it as an advantage. The farm account had not needed the apology or the release. The farm account had been doing its work since 1951. The work had produced 12 tractors in March of 1977. The fund had been at 0 in November of 1977. The rebuild had begun at the established rate. The work continued. That was the whole account. That was sufficient. Fenwick had regretted the opening for the rest of his professional career. The regret had made him better at his work. The better work had served subsequent customers who would otherwise have received the assessorial opening. The accessorial opening had been corrected before it produced another bank letter on another desk. That was the account's contribution to the dealership's practice, in addition to the 12 tractors, in addition to the 26 years, in addition to the fund doing its work from zero to the threshold. That was the complete account. That was everything. The Auglaize County Farming Community's account of the March 1977 courthouse transaction had settled by the mid-1980s into the stable form that community accounts took when they had been processed through enough retellings to find their definitive shape. The stable form had 3 elements: the bank letter, the exchange of apology and release, and the 12 tractors. The bank letter had become, in the community's vocabulary, the shorthand for the whole category of prepared documentation that a privately held financial position required in order to be visible to an institutional interlocutor whose assessment framework did not include private financial positions. When Auglaize County farmers discussed transactions that required documenting their financial capacity to an institution that had not previously known their financial position, they said, "You'll need a bank letter," the way the courthouse man brought one in '77. The community had also absorbed the exchange between Fenwick and Alvin. "I owe you an apology. You were working from the information you had," as a template for the specific kind of professional correction that the agricultural community valued. The direct acknowledgement of error without defensive qualification, and the direct acceptance of the acknowledgement without the extraction of advantage. The exchange had been considered in the community's memory as the most professionally mature moment in the transaction's account. Not the bank letter, not the package discount, not the 12 tractors, but the 2 sentences that had followed the bank letter's correction of the accessorial assumption. The 3 elements had been transmitted through the community's normal channels: the cooperative meetings, the elevator conversations, the specific inheritance of farming knowledge from parent to child that agricultural communities practice through the kitchen table and the farm account and the field alongside the working generation. David had transmitted them to his own son Marcus in the late 1990s, when Marcus had been in his late teens and beginning the farm work that would eventually lead to his own primary management. The transmission had been at the kitchen table with the farm account open, in the format that the courthouse family had always used for the transmission of farm management knowledge. He had said the March '77 transaction was not primarily about 12 tractors. It was primarily about the fund doing 26 years of work and then being deployed when the conditions were right. The bank letter was what made the fund's work visible to the institution that needed to see it. The apology was what happened when the institution's assessment had been based on insufficient information, and the institution acknowledged this directly. The 12 tractors were what the fund produced. Marcus had said, the transaction history was the insufficient information. David had said, the transaction history was the information the institution had. It was not insufficient in itself. It was insufficient as a proxy for the financial position. The institution was using it as a proxy because the financial position was private. The bank letter made the financial position visible. That was the bank letter's function. Marcus had said, my great-grandfather could have built the fund for 26 years and had the conversation fail because the dealer closed the conversation before the bank letter was on the desk. David had said, your great-grandfather anticipated this possibility and prepared the bank letter specifically to prevent it. The preparation was part of the transaction planning. The planning included the preparation for the institution's standard professional assumption. Marcus had written in the farm accounts margin in 1999, the plan includes the preparation for the institution's standard assumption. The bank letter is prepared before the conversation, not in response to it. This margin note had been in the farm account since 1999. It had been beside the annual entries of a fund that was still building at the established rate toward the next transaction that the fund's next threshold would produce, at the courthouse family's established rate that had been the same since Alvin's father had specified it in 1951. The fund had been building. The threshold had not yet been reached for the next transaction that the planning horizon was tracking. The planning horizon was tracking. The farm account was recording the progress. The November review was reading the progress annually, as it had read it since Alvin's father's time. That was the discipline. That was the whole account. That was sufficient. The dealer had laughed, or had given the accessorial opening that the community's account had compressed into something resembling a laugh. The dealer had then regretted it for the rest of his professional career, because the bank letter had been on the desk, and the bank letter had described 26 years. And 26 years had bought 12 tractors, and 12 tractors had been the fund doing its work. That was everything.